But we were able to put together a fair amount of evidence on all of the defendants regarding their anti-black animus, including, this slide ends up being a little bit dark. Can everyone see this picture? This is a tattoo that, this is a picture of Defendant Armstrong, obviously not his face, and there's a big swastika tattoo on his upper left chest, and there was evidence from Mr. Whitewater that Mr. Armstrong, before they chased our victim across the parking lot, lifted up his t-shirt and patted his tattoo to start the charge, and we were able to find, we of course meaning the FBI and Detective Kimball, a prior incident where Mr. Armstrong had not, although he had not assaulted anyone, done the same thing to intimidate an Hispanic woman and her children away from a common swimming pool at an apartment complex they were living in. So an earlier case we prosecuted in Idaho, also out of Canyon County, United States versus Maurer et al., involved a group of 6 young white men who were involved in a series of racially motivated assaults in Nampa, Caldwell, and Canyon County outside of Nampa and Caldwell in the early or mid-1990s. All of these individuals spent time in federal prison, including 3 individuals who were under the age of 18 at the time they committed the assaults. In the federal system, it's pretty unusual to prosecute juveniles, but in hate crimes cases, there have been a fair number of times where, because of the person's criminal history, the things that they've done prior to our incident, we've been able to get them transferred to adult status for prosecution, which is a pretty high standard to meet. And so all 3 of the individuals who were under 18 at the time of our crimes had prior hate-related incidents as juveniles. So I'm going to give you a sample of a couple of other cases that we've had in the federal system that are hate crimes cases. These are all prosecuted under the newer Shepard-Byrd Hate Crimes Act. The United States versus Avery involved a 26-year-old Detroit man who got 18 months in prison for the assault of a gay man simply behind him in line in a convenience store. So the evidence of racial bias, anti-gay bias, were slurs used during the while the two were in line. A case out of Georgia, similar, very surprisingly similar fact pattern, grocery store in Atlanta, a gay man again assaulted by a number of other individuals. So, and then we have down here again we don't get the smart ones. So a 4th man with the defendants videotaped the assault and posted it to the internet. So these guys are proud of their crimes, and I think one of the reasons this happens is not only are they proud of what they've done, but what else do you think that they're thinking by posting it to the internet?
Showing what they can do.
Showing what they can do, and you know what else? It's okay. It's okay. You know, I don't see anything wrong with posting that to the internet because I didn't do anything wrong. Of course, they learn differently. A very recent case in terms of its resolution, conspiracy case in Mississippi, where 8 defendants were sentenced to pretty long terms in prison, between 48 months for those who were the least culpable, so 4 years in prison, and 600 months, which is, I mean, my math is really bad, but I'm thinking that's 50 years. I don't know who else, I mean, 12 times 5 is 60, and so I'm thinking that's 50 years. So that's basically a life sentence. And these individuals had a conspiracy where they would target African Americans just to beat the crap out of them, ended up killing 1 individual. And they targeted individuals that were homeless or they believed were under the influence of alcohol because they would be easier targets and because no one would care if they beat them up. There are 2 individuals, 2 people got sentenced last week, and there are 2 more waiting to go. And then a Western case, a Yuba City, California case, white man, African-American woman pull into the parking lot of a convenience store and are attacked by an individual. Attack actually occurred by 3 individuals. Mr. Tyler was just sentenced recently, and he had the words "white pride" tattooed on his body and a swastika. Again, hopeful evidence. So I've talked a lot about the cases that we prosecute and how we prosecute these cases and protected statuses. I want to spend some time talking about victims in these cases. So how are the victims harmed? And I think probably the most compelling explanation of that I got was not for someone who really would sit down and articulate how it was harmed, but it came from a woman named Clara Blackman, who I met in 1994 when I was a pretty new lawyer at the Civil Rights Division. And Ms. Blackman lived in a small town about an hour away from Kansas City, Missouri. And the town was occupied by very, very few African Americans, her family and a couple of others. She she was in her about mid-50s, I think, at the time. She lived in a nice small house with a white picket fence around the house and some prized rose bushes just inside the fence. Across the street and down a little bit from her was the home of a young man whose father was a district attorney, and he had some friends over, and they would sometimes go throw their football out in the street, and at one point they threw their football and it landed in Ms. Blackman's prized rose bushes, and she didn't particularly care for that. She worked hard on the rose bushes and chastised them a little bit. Well, not too long after that, I forget exactly how long, it's been 20 years, they decided that they were going to burn a cross in Ms. Blackman's yard. And so and this is also the kind of thing that they do, they built a cross from the stairs that were outside of this little like storage hut that they had in their backyard. So they're taking apart, rather than go buy wood, they take the stairs apart. And they built a cross and burned it on Ms. Blackman's lawn, right on her lawn. Well, this happened in the early 1990s. Ms. Blackman was, in about mid-50s, so she had, she was a young woman during the civil rights era, and a child before that when things weren't going so well for African Americans in the United States, and particularly in the South. She was raised in the South, and we were looking at the case. They had prosecuted one individual, and we were looking at whether there was a conspiracy and whether there were others who could be prosecuted. And I went to this town with one of my colleagues who was a very experienced civil rights prosecutor, and it was going to be my job to talk to the victim. I hadn't really done that before. It was my first hate crimes case. And she worked at a school. She worked in the cafeteria of a school. So when we went to talk to her, we had to sit in those little teeny chairs. And if you ever had to, any of you remember what those are like? They're small. And I remember sitting down with her and, just figuring, here I am, I'm interviewing a victim. And I said to her, Ms. Blackman, and this, by the time we were there, it was about 2 years after the incident, I said, do you remember about the night that the cross was burned in your lawn? And she said to me, Ms. Olson, I remember it like it was yesterday. I remember it like it was yesterday. And tears started down her cheeks. The mere act of that cross being burned in her lawn had brought back all sorts of memories of what was going on in this country in her youth and what her family had endured as an African American family in a place that there weren't a lot of African Americans. In the early 1990s, in a small town outside of St. Louis, Missouri, I'm pretty confident that she thought that that was all behind her, and it wasn't. I remember it like it was yesterday. And whenever now I meet with witnesses, I always think of Clara Blackman, and really, in part because I was very naive when I went to meet with her. They don't give lawyers, prosecutors, a lot of, at least they didn't back then, training on how to interact with victims. We had victim witness specialists at the time. Their major job was to make sure that there were arrangements made to get the victims to court to testify. And so now, I think I'm much more careful in the way I approach people who have been victimized, and particularly in these hate crimes cases, where the attack is not just a threat or a physical attack, but really at the very heart of who they are as a person and their sense of belonging to a community and to this country. And so the comments that they get are of that nature. What country do you think you're in? The victim, the case I told you about in the Bullard case. And then in that Maurer case, the one that I talked about from before that, go back to your own country. What they said to some of the victims immediately before the assault, and particularly there was a young couple who were engaged to be married, and one of the defendants said it right at her face, go back to your own country. Well, she was born and raised in Canyon County, Idaho. This is her country. So in hate crimes, I think what we see is not just that the crime targets the individual who is targeted, but it's directed at an entire community, because most of the time the victims are picked at random because of what they represent rather than necessarily what that individual has said or done. And it can be purely random. I'm confident, having worked on the case, that Michael Bullard and Richard Armstrong and James Whitewater had no intent, as of about 12:02 on July 4th of 2008, to beat up the victim in our case, because they didn't know him, they didn't know they were going to encounter him. But when they saw him and they knew what they didn't like and he provided an opportunity, they attacked. So I think this contributes then to the victim's sort of sense of helplessness, because they can't identify one thing that they've done that would have drawn that attention to them. And the thing that drew the crime to them was because of how they looked, or the perception of how they looked. And again, victims often don't know their attackers, so there's a greater sense of helplessness there. We often have victims who come from groups who are wary of law enforcement. When I worked on the Maurer case when I was pretty new, had moved back, I grew up in Pocatello and then lived out of the state and moved back to Idaho. And we were canvassing the neighborhood to see if we could find either additional victims or witnesses to one of the assaults that had occurred in the porch area of a larger apartment complex. And there were a lot of witnesses who wouldn't come answer the door, or a lot of people who lived there who wouldn't come answer the door if there was someone there who was in a uniform. Unfortunately, we were also sort of stuck in and there were a number of people in the area that were believed to be undocumented. One of the first things we would have to tell them is, we're not here about your immigration status. We want to talk to you and see what you saw. And then in hate crimes cases, and you've probably seen from the examples I've given, oftentimes, and I think these are incredibly cowardly crimes, because it's often one victim against a group of assailants. And it's oftentimes there's something that's going on with that group of assailants that gets them sort of fired up to go and commit that act. When I was at the Civil Rights Division from 92 to 97, the number of cases I had where it was young white men and who were not particularly well educated, not particularly well employed, and had all been, the movie Mississippi Burning came up in about 4 cases in a row, and they were needing to feel, I think, superior to somebody, and they got their hate fueled and went out and committed these hate crimes. But it is these characteristics, I think, make these crimes many times significantly different from other kinds of assaults and warrant their special attention from investigators and prosecutors. So, and I think we're probably a little ahead of schedule here, so if I need to fill up time for you to get your credits, I can take a lot more questions. So here in Idaho, so I said the FBI is the primary investigator of hate crimes, and here is their contact information. And then in my office, the person now who handles the hate crimes is our criminal chief, Aaron Lukoff. That's our main number there. We also have prosecutors who've been through the criminal civil rights training in our Coeur d'Alene office and in our Eastern Idaho office in Pocatello. And would encourage you, certainly, if you hear of anything, to call my office or to call the FBI. We've worked pretty closely with law enforcement throughout the state to let them know about this option. We've also worked very closely with the civil rights community throughout the state. Once a year we hold what we call our Civil Rights Information Sharing Meeting, where we invite a broad array of civil rights leaders and advocates to our office, along with the FBI and others, to let them know about the work that we're doing and to have them share the work that we're doing. We meet periodically with representatives of the various Muslim communities in the greater Treasure Valley and also in Moscow, Lewiston, Coeur d'Alene, and in Pocatello to make sure that members of those communities are familiar with what the federal government can do. We have followed closely, of course, the efforts of many in Idaho to try to see the malicious harassment statute in Idaho amended to include more protected statuses. One of the things that it has been, and we will work pretty closely with county prosecuting attorneys on hate crimes cases to determine where the best forum is to prosecute those cases. The malicious, are any of you familiar with the malicious harassment statute here in Idaho? So it's one of the nice things about it is you don't have to prove there's no because of federally protected activities. There are protected statuses that are set out there. There's also, if there's property damage because of the race or perceived race of the person who owns it, that can be prosecuted under the malicious harassment statute. So it provides a good avenue there, but it does not include sexual orientation, gender identity, which makes it different, of course, from the Matthew Shepard James Berginer Act, but we need to, in those cases, prove interstate commerce. So there are a few differences there. Now I'm going to put up my favorite slide. Those are my dogs. There's really only 3 of them. The top 2 are the same dog. That's the. But are there questions you have either about this topic, victim rights, the federal system generally, or anything about the U.S. Attorney's Office? Yes.
What did you say Ford was charged under?
He was charged under 18 U.S.C. 245, which is the public accommodations or the federally protected rights statute. And the reason for that is, like I mentioned, I was going to say what the reason for that was. So that the Walmart, where the attack essentially started and occurred, was considered a place of public accommodation. Not because it was a grocery store. To be a place of public accommodation, there has to be someone that invites people in for a period of time. And in the civil statute, they're sort of listed out what those places are. And so public accommodations are include places of entertainment and places where people are invited in to be seated to eat food or beverage on the premises. So the grocery store part didn't count, but there were 2 things in that Walmart that turned it into a place of public accommodation. And I have to say that the Nampa police detective was a little surprised when we insisted on getting that evidence before we could go forward, because who cares what's in there? So can anyone think of what was in a Walmart that would make it fall under?
They have a McDonald's and they may have an arcade.
Those were exactly it. They had a McDonald's and they had an arcade at the time, and so that made it a place of public accommodation. It was the McDonald's was not open at the time. That didn't matter, and then the arcade actually was shut down and converted into what else do you usually find in the front of a grocery store these days? A bank. By the time we got to trial, we had some good pictures of the arcade that we could introduce at trial. It always throws the jury off in those cases where you're introducing pictures of the McDonald's, that's really important. But in order for the federal government to have jurisdiction, that was one of the things we needed to prove. Yes.
That's a question. If that ever came up again and they didn't have an arcade, but they had like in the electronics department where you could play like the Xboxes and stuff, would that be considered?
It might be if you could show that people routinely came in and did that for a period of time. Okay. There was a case in California that involved a racially motivated assault at a 7-Eleven store, and the 7-Eleven store just had a couple of game machines. It was a long time ago, so I think one of them was those Asteroids, and initially the trial judge dismissed the indictment in that case and said, just because you got a couple of machines doesn't make you a place of entertainment. And the Ninth Circuit reversed and said, yes, it does. And so those are the kinds of things we look at to see whether or not there's federal jurisdiction. And one of the purposes of passing the Shepard-Byrd Hate Crimes Act was to sort of eliminate that part of it. We all sort of gotten over that the federal government would just charge everybody who did everything all the time, and it was essential to proving some of these cases to eliminate that element where they could. But it's still a useful statute, particularly in a threats case. Yes?
If you kind of see harassment going on, or maybe the beginnings of maybe a potential hate crime happening, what can you do as a bystander?
Well,
Record.
yeah. I mean, recording is. I mean, you all now can have the capability of doing that. It's absolutely stunning, and the amount of media that we typically have to go through in cases now is pretty stunning. What I would do, I mean, depending on where you are, I mean, you want to call 911 as quickly as you can. You want to not ever put yourself in danger, but if there's a way that you can alert the individuals involved that you're there and you're watching, and do so safely, because you want to maintain your safety. But certainly calling 911 and recording from a safe spot. Yes, sir.
Do you know which areas in Idaho that they have LGBT protections? I know in Boise and I know in Falls you cannot be kicked out of your house or lose your job because of it, but I know that there were some issues a couple of years ago where the gay community was saying they didn't feel comfortable going to the police before those protections were in place, because if they went to trial for like a hate crime attack, then they could lose their job, they could lose where they live, all those kinds of things. Do you know what other spots in Idaho?
Yeah, and I mean, you're exactly right. So we have actually been as supportive as we are allowed to, because we can't lobby of states that will, or of cities that will pass that, because when we've met with the LGBT community locally, that's one of the things that they've said is, this is a great resource, but I don't want to, have to out myself and potentially lose jobs, home. Obviously, Boise has one. Most of the major cities do now. I used to keep track of this for fair housing when I do fair housing presentations, and then I got replaced in that part of the fair housing presentation. So, but Sandpoint, Coeur d'Alene, Pocatello. I think there are 7. Moscow. I think they're up to 7. I can't remember if Nampa and Caldwell have passed them, but they were considering them. And then a lot of mayors, and including the mayor in Caldwell, have passed protections for city employees and made it clear that they're not going to discriminate based on LGBT status. So cities have really been the leaders in Idaho in doing that. Happy to stick around for a little bit, but I hope you enjoy the rest of the Victim Rights Week's presentation. I think it's important that you're here, and would encourage those of you who are interested in a career in the criminal justice system to do that. It's very rewarding and very interesting, and I'm happy to visit with anyone about that as well. Thanks, you guys.